Hello, good evening, and welcome to the lecture on Caribbean Studies. My name is Dr. Camille Hernández-Ramdwar, and I'm the academic coordinator for Caribbean Studies at Ryerson University. And I've been teaching in Caribbean Studies for over 25 years now. I love it. It's a wonderful topic to teach, and certainly heard a lot of positive feedback from students over the years. And just to let people know that all kinds of people take Caribbean studies. Yes, we have people who are of Caribbean background for sure, who like to come, learn about their history, learn about their identity. But we have lots and lots of students who come to Caribbean studies from all different kinds of backgrounds and find it extremely enriching, exciting, interesting, inspiring. So I just want to put that out there to let people know that you don't have to be of Caribbean background to enjoy Caribbean studies or to enroll in Caribbean studies. So the topic of tonight's lecture is Caribbean studies in these times. And I chose this topic because we're living in unprecedented times, obviously, not just because of COVID-19 and how that's affected us globally, but also because of the really prominent rise of protests against racism, in particular anti-Black racism, that we're seeing occurring as well globally, and calls for justice, and people from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds, young, old, Black, white, all different races, all different cultures coming out and saying enough is enough. And I thought about that in relation to the topics that I teach and that my colleagues teach in Caribbean Studies. And we've been teaching about these issues for a very long time. This is the basis of Caribbean Studies. So I want to talk about that tonight, about how relevant actually Caribbean Studies is to everything that's happening right now in the world, in particular, the rise in anti-racist activism. So I'm calling 2020 a year of reckoning. The images that I have here are of Black Lives Matters protests occurring across Europe. The UK, United Kingdom, in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and then of course there's some other pictures there, as you can see, New Zealand and Syria and Canada. And you might say, so what does this have to do with the Caribbean? This has everything to do with the Caribbean. The statues that are being toppled are representative of European colonialism. One of the statues being toppled there, I think the one in Bristol on the top left corner, excuse me, is of a slave trader. The city of Bristol was founded on slavery, on the transatlantic African slave trade. It was one of the main ports in England for slave ships. Many of the European countries, the wealth in Europe is absolutely directly linked to the enslavement of African peoples and the sugar plantations that were created in the Caribbean and persisted for centuries. The wealth that was generated from those sugar plantations went directly to Europe to enrich Europe. And I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to globalization in this lecture. But to see these images for myself, for many of my colleagues, my friends, family, and so on, was incredibly moving this summer to watch, particularly young people. And you can see it's a multiracial crowd, but it's predominantly young. And to see this crowd of young people who are aware of this history and they are aware of the injustices that have been done and not been righted. They are aware of the 500 plus years of colonialism and now neocolonialism, the remnants of colonialism that persist in creating inequalities in the world. And the Caribbean is directly tied to this story because the Caribbean was the first place where Europeans really sort of set up a laboratory almost of how to make explicit profit and use the bodies of Black and brown people to do it. So this is a year of reckoning because all of these images are unprecedented. I personally, never thought in my lifetime I would see these statues come down and come down so quickly and so easily. And I had no idea that there were so many people that felt as angered by their presence as I did and my colleagues. So this is a really, really important historical moment. And hopefully it won't just be a moment. Hopefully it will mean that we are having a shift in consciousness as a people, as a human civilization, to say never again in terms of these historical injustices. So we know that a lot of the activism that we've seen, the protests and so on, are directly linked to colonialism. We also have to acknowledge the Caribbean as arguably the first colonized space, or one of the first colonized spaces that was colonized by European nations, starting with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. And maybe I'll just take a second here to say, no, he did not discover the Caribbean. He did not discover America. I still have students writing this, even though I try to drum it into people's heads that Columbus could never discover something that had already been there for thousands of years and had been inhabited by human beings for thousands of years. So he discovered nothing. He arrived, he stumbled upon the Caribbean, and actually still thought he was in India till the day he died. But that's another story. So when we talk about the Caribbean as the first colonized space, we have to understand, as I said in the previous slide, that Europeans almost used the Caribbean as a laboratory, in that they imported not just sugarcane, which was their experiment to see how well sugarcane would grow. It's not native to the Caribbean. It had to be brought in. Plantations were set up, huge plantations, acres and acres and acres. Basically, the entire Caribbean, for the most part, was planted in sugarcane, which left little else, little space for other crops to be grown. People were imported. At first, it was the indigenous populations there. They were quickly decimated by disease, by war, by genocide, by exile, by fleeing. They fled the scene. And then the European colonizers brought in other populations of people. And it's the estimates of how many Africans were shipped across the Middle Passage. And that's what the video behind me is. I was hoping I would be able to get it to play while I was talking, but I wasn't able to. So I ask that you please click on that link and watch this video after this lecture, because it is quite stunning to see the amount of slave ships that went directly from Africa to the Caribbean. And the Caribbean, I hope you know your geography, but the Caribbean is that small group of islands there. South of Florida, you see Florida sticking out there from the bottom of the United States, and to the east of Mexico, the large island there is Cuba. The one next to it is Hispaniola, which consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And then we have Puerto Rico and Jamaica's in there, and so on and so on. But when you watch those little black dots, which are slave ships that were full of hundreds of enslaved Africans, when you watch the amount of those little black dots flying across that ocean, specifically to the Caribbean, and you can see in the little chart below how many. Now it's estimated here they have something like 3.6 million. That's far below the actual numbers. The estimates that I use are between 15 and 25 million people that were transported across that stretch of ocean, which is known as the Middle Passage, during the transatlantic slave trade. So the first colonized space, as I said, was the experiment for Europeans to see how they could control populations. And the Caribbean is different from other places that were colonized, because in those other spaces, humans weren't imported to that degree. So we know that most of Africa was colonized by Europeans, most of Asia, certainly South America, Mexico, Central America, Canada, United States. But in those cases, Australia, New Zealand, in those cases, the people were not transplanted. They were the original people, they stayed there, and colonizers invaded and set up shop. The Caribbean is different because people were imported and dropped there and forced to labor. So that is a quite different situation. The whole project of colonialism was about European colonizers setting themselves up as superior and enforcing their superiority on the people that they colonized. So colonizers set themselves up as superior and they insist that everybody else see them as that. The colonized, on the other hand, are taught to see themselves as inferior. And so the scenario is set up. And if there is more than one group of colonized people in a colony, the colonizers taught these colonized people to hate each other, to mistrust each other. They would play favorites so that there was competition set up amongst these groups. And we see this again and again. And it's important to understand this again, bringing it into the present in 2020, about how important solidarity is and uniting against a common oppressor. Instead, we find ourselves often, oh, I don't know, does that person belong to my group? Can they qualify? I mean, I'll just, use a very recent example, Kamala Harris, who is running for Vice President of the United States right now. And people are in a tizzy about what is she, because she's mixed race, right? And they can't figure out if she's for us or against us because they can't pin her down to a race, which frankly is quite ridiculous because race has nothing to do with a person's politics or values or behavior or character. So these are some of the fallacies that colonialism has left us. The way we need to feel we need to mistrust each other and divide ourselves amongst each other instead of looking for our commonalities and working together based on our values as opposed to the crap that the colonizers taught us. Divide and rule. Keep that one in mind. So another way that the Caribbean is very significant to the times that we're now in is that the Caribbean has always been a site of resistance from, as I said, the time that Columbus arrives. Even though he's embraced by the Taino people, the original indigenous people, pretty quickly it's evident that the Europeans have not arrived to be friends. And so we see a continually long struggle of Caribbean people coming together to resist a common oppressor. The picture on the very left is of the Garifuna people meeting with the British. The Garifuna are a very interesting group of people who are truly Caribbean in that their ancestors were both indigenous people, the Kalinago people of St. Vincent, who got together with the survivors of a African slave ship that shipwrecked on the coast of St. Vincent. The people came on shore, the Africans, they got together with the Kalinago people, and in a generation or two, there was a new group of people called the Garifuna, who have both indigenous and African ancestry. This group of people is still around today. However, you are not likely to find many of them in St. Vincent because what this picture is illustrating is the exile of the Garifuna from St. Vincent by the British in the 17th century. They were sent to Honduras. They were sent to an island off the coast of Honduras called Roatan. They eventually migrated to Belize. So they are really predominantly found in Central American countries. But they are a group of people that for centuries, for a very long time, resisted the colonizers. St. Vincent was one of the last places to be colonized in the Caribbean. And so we have a very early example of that. The large picture in the middle is an illustration of the Haitian Revolution, which is one of my favorite topics to teach. And certainly it's one of the favorite topics of many of my students because they have never learned about it. And it's an incredibly important historical moment that we should all know about, predominantly because it is the only example of enslaved Africans overthrowing slavery and the colonizers and expelling the colonizers from the new Black Republic of Haiti that was then run by the ex-slaves. Haiti pays a price for this because the European colonial nations, France, England, even the United States gets in the act, all repel Haiti after this. They refuse to recognize Haiti as a free nation. And the long, sad story of Haiti's demise and struggle to remain a dignified and sovereign nation continues. We can bring this right up into the present. Haiti is still constantly in the news. There's civil unrest. There's pandemics going on there. There's earthquakes. There's all, Haiti is always seen as a sort of tragic case. But we need to understand the history of Haiti. So a very, very important example of Caribbean people resisting their oppressors. And then the last picture on the far right, that is a photograph of Fidel Castro and his comrades riding triumphantly into the city of Havana in Cuba as they won the revolution. And you can see the crowd. That's a mixed crowd. There's Black people there, there's mixed people there, there's white Cubans there. It's all Cubans. But the Cuban people united against the common oppressor, which at that point in time was the United States. United States Americans who were basically running Cuba at the time, and a dictator that was allowing it to happen. And so they united across class, across race, across religion, across region, to come together to support the revolutionaries and throw the Americans out. So these are a few of many, many examples of resistance. And I think, again, going back to my last slide where I was talking about divide and rule, there are some very important lessons for us to learn here about coming together across difference to unite against the common oppressor, which is really much of what we're talking about now. What we're seeing in these protests, what we've seen this summer, again, is people coming together out in the streets, fearless. Young people, old people, children, middle-aged people, rich, young, Black, white, brown, mix, all different kinds of races, all different kinds of cultures, all different kinds of abilities, all different kinds of identities coming out to unite against a common oppressor and a common issue, and saying enough is enough. We've heard a lot about globalization in 2020, particularly in regards to the travel of disease and the pandemic of COVID-19. But this kind of globalization has been with us for a very long time, including the travel of disease. And again, the Caribbean plays a very, very central role in this. The Caribbean has arguably been called the first globalized space on the planet. And I mentioned the importation not only of plants such as sugarcane, and there were many other plants that were imported, like mangoes, which people take for granted were always in the Caribbean. Nope. Ganja, marijuana, cannabis. People think, oh, it was always there and Rastas were always smoking it. Nope. Ganja was imported with indentured Indian laborers in the 19th century. But the Caribbean has really been a first globalized space economically as well and politically, and again was set up in that way. So the illustration on the left is of the triangle trade. And the triangle trade existed from the, let's say, 1600s, around 1650 onwards, up until the 19th century, up until the late 1880s. And what you see is a trade that was going on between Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. So we have, let's say, starting in Europe, those slave ships from ports such as Bristol and Liverpool and so on would travel down the west coast of Africa where there were many slave ports. These slave ports were in existence when Europeans arrived, and I think it's also important to understand that. Sometimes I have students who believe that the way that the African slave trade happened was evil Europeans showed up and with nets and clubs and went into the jungles of Africa and clubbed Africans over their head and dragged them onto ships. That's not what happened. There were slave ports already set up by Africans. There were There was a system of slavery set up by Africans. Africans sold other Africans as slaves. The system of slavery in West Africa was not the same as what happened to people once they crossed the Middle Passage and they went to the Caribbean and South America and North America and so on. It wasn't the same. But to say that Europeans invented slavery is a fallacy. So there was the complicity of Africans in the African slave trade. I think that's also a very important point for us to remember, again, looking at the current historical moment. Just because somebody looks like you or comes from the same community that you come from does not necessarily mean that they are your ally, or that you share political views, or that you share the same values, or that you have the same character. And we mustn't get caught up in that. So back to the triangle trade. Europeans went to the coast of Africa. They traded manufactured goods, guns, chains, whips, alcohol, glass beads, fabrics for human beings. And of course, gold, money, coins, and so on. They loaded their ships with human beings and crossed the Middle Passage, the enslaved Africans. They arrive in the Caribbean, they disperse of their cargo, of human cargo, and they continue. The ships now are filled with sugar and the byproducts of sugar, so molasses and rum. And they travel back to Europe. And on their way, and this is where Canada gets into the story in a very interesting way. On their way back, as you can see, they're passing Newfoundland. They stop and they pick up cod, dried salted cod on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Why? Because that same salted cod is going to be used to feed enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. And to this day, I can't think of a single Caribbean nation that you go to where saltfish is not on the menu, or bacalao, or salted cod, whatever you call it, it's there. Same with South America, Central America, and so on. Bacalao, saltfish, salt cod is found everywhere. It comes directly from slave food on the plantation. So that is one way that Canada was actually a part of this triangle trade. So that's an example of early globalization. The next image is to show you a more recent example. And this is where the Caribbean is still caught up in a new way in globalization, and that's in the drug trade. So we know that cannabis is being legalized more and more in very many countries, including Caribbean countries. It's now being legalized, which is great because the Caribbean produces very good ganja. However, the biggest problem for the Caribbean is that for the past 50 years now, almost, or 30 to 40 years, the Caribbean has been a major transshipment point for cocaine. Cocaine does not come from the Caribbean. It is produced in South America, but it is shipped through the Caribbean in very large amounts. And this fact, and then as you can see from the map, it goes to the global north. It goes to global north markets, particularly North America, but it also crosses the Atlantic Ocean and goes to Europe. Cocaine is a big, big business still. And the impact that the presence of cocaine transshipment has had on the Caribbean has been disastrous. It has increased the levels of corruption in our societies. It has increased the levels of violence, the levels of crime, the murder rates. It has caused people to flee their countries because of the crime rate, because of the murder rates. It has created a rise in addictions in our society. It has been absolutely terrible. And we have what are really quasi-narco states, which means countries that are now being run predominantly on money from that drug trade. Politicians that are being bought, governments that are being bought, so that we're no longer producing anything, right? So it's put the Caribbean in a very, very, very precarious position. So there's been a very long history of globalization has not been good for the Caribbean. And it's important for us to understand that that in the same way that we see the globalized movement of a virus right now, for example, and how devastating that can be, the Caribbean has had a very long history of being devastated by globalization. And another point that I want to make about how this relates to our current situation, and this is really bringing it home to Canada now, is that we need to understand that Caribbean people have had a presence in Canada for a very long time, predominantly as forms of labor, which is, again, taking us back to the days of colonialism. The picture right above me, the black and white picture of all those women, and I think one man amongst them, is one of the first group photos of domestic workers who came to work in the homes of rich white Canadians in the 1950s. These women were directly recruited from the Caribbean for their labor, for their quote-unquote expertise, the belief that somehow Caribbean women were natural nannies and nurturers and caregivers and so on. And so this was a program of our government that did this. These women came, they had to be single, they had to be childless. Of course, some of them did have children, but they didn't disclose that. They came to Canada and they settled here and they sent for their families. So many Caribbean Canadian people traced their ancestry to a woman that came and worked as a domestic laborer in the home of a rich white Canadian. This is very similar to colonialism, slavery, indentureship, and the plantation. Same kind of serving, servile labor. The photo at the very top with the gentleman in yellow jackets is a present-day example of this. These are Caribbean migrant farm workers who work on farms in different places in Canada, but predominantly in Ontario, we have quite a few of these, both men and women, who travel up, spend 8 months of the year picking our crops, because these are jobs that Canadians don't want to do. They don't live in great conditions. They don't see their families for 8 months of the year. And many of these people do this kind of work for 10 to 20 years of their life. They do it so that they can send their kids to school, so that they can provide for their families. They do not get Canadian citizenship. They don't get the same benefits as Canadians, and yet they are supporting our economy. Some of the other pictures here, you can see Albert's Real Jamaican Foods and Ali's Roti 2, favorite Caribbean food spots in Toronto, a Jamaican patty above me there. You know, these have now become ubiquitous food items in Canada, specifically in Toronto, but they can be found elsewhere, and they've become known and loved in Canada as part of our food. Caravana, or Toronto Caribbean Carnival, again, there's a photo there. And there are many Caribbean Carnival-like celebrations throughout Canada. So that is another example of Caribbean culture. And then we have a picture of Haitians protesting in Montreal. And again, the Haitian presence in Canada has a long history, predominantly in Quebec. However, Canada's role in Haiti has not been a supportive one. It has been an exploitive one. And so in this particular instance, Haitians are protesting some of the changes to immigration law that was preventing family unification and so on, and making it difficult for Haitians to continue to migrate to Canada. And yet, again, these are people whose labor supports our economy, is a very significant part of Canadian life. And finally, the last, I just want to draw attention to a concise guide to Toronto slang. This has been in the news a lot lately, is this supposedly new language called Toronto slang, which many of the words and terms and expressions are completely based on Jamaican patois and other Caribbean words and phrases. And yet that tends to get erased by this new term Toronto slang, when of course for many Caribbean people it's like, but that's how we speak and we've always spoken that way. And interestingly, when we speak like this, we're discriminated against, or our children are discriminated against and sent to English as a second language classes, but somehow now this is a cool thing, and when other people who are non-Caribbean people or non-racialized people speak it, it's cool. So these are some things to think about. So just to recap, Caribbean studies in these times, in our Caribbean studies courses, we touch on all these topics and more. We touch on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. We talk extensively about colonialism and neocolonialism. We talk about globalization, slavery, indentureship, which is a form of contract labor that also brought many people to the Caribbean. We talk about genocide that particularly affected Indigenous populations. We also talk about liberation and resistance, how people overcame their oppression. We talk about the links between tourism and neocolonialism. We talk about globalization and the plantation. We talk about how Caribbean cultures, music, dance, literature, film, language, hairstyles, religion, how Caribbean cultures can be forms of resistance. We talk about LGBTQI, etc., rights in the present day Caribbean, which is an ongoing struggle. We talk about gender-based violence and the legacy of colonialism, which again is sadly a real issue that we have to deal with in the Caribbean. Finally, I just want to draw your attention to the Caribbean Studies Certificate. So if you click on the link there, it will take you to the page that explains what the Caribbean Studies Certificate is and what it consists of. Basically, that you would have to do 6 Caribbean Studies courses over a period of 3 years. There is one required course, which is the Intro to Caribbean Studies, the CRB 100. Of course, you can sign up for the certificate. If you're not sure about the certificate, you're very welcome to take 1 or 2 courses just to see how you like them. And then if you do and you'd like to do more, you can certainly sign up for the certificate. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to the Q&A.